Today I'm going to take you through a hip external rotation mobilization progression using functional range conditioning kin stretch principles. We're going to begin in the 90-90 position, okay? If this position is challenging for someone, we're going to want to stack something underneath the front leg. I have with me an AirX pad, for example. I'm going to put that AirX pad along the length of my leg. Other things that work could be a foam roller, a yoga block. Ultimately, whatever device you're using to help the position, you're going to find the minimally necessary height to feel comfortable in that 90-90, which is to say, with an AirX pad, I'm elevating my leg a couple inches. With a yoga block, I'm elevating my leg maybe 3 inches. With a foam roller, maybe 4 to 5 inches. Ultimately, you decide which sort of tool underneath your leg is going to create the most comfortable, most vertical torso 90-90 position. So, beginning again, here, 90-90, we're going to start with a so-called kinetic stretch. With a kinetic stretch, I'm going to use the short tissue in my groin, the so-called regressive tissue, to pull myself down into the basement of the stretch, targeting the tissues on the back of, in this case, my right hip. I'm now going to use the lengthened, so-called progressive tissue in the butt, back of the hip, to drive my leg into the ground, coming back up to a tall position. We're going to progress this exercise as follows. Hands to the side of the leg, supporting a little bit will be the easiest position. Crossing the arms will be harder. Extending the arms to the side will be harder still. And then reaching the arms up vertically toward the ceiling will be the most complicated position. For the purposes of demonstrating, I'm going to cross my arms here, and I'm going to do a few reps of kinetic stretching, beginning again. Using the regressive tissue, I'm pulling myself down into the stretch, then driving my leg using the progressive tissue into the ground, coming back up to a tall position. Pulling myself to the basement of the stretch, driving myself out of the stretch. One more. Pulling myself down into the stretch, driving myself out of the stretch. You're going to complete 4 to 5 sequences like that. Good, slow, controlled motion, trying to warm up the hip for progressively more difficult external rotation kind of load. The next step in our sequence will be a so-called eccentric stretch into external rotation. Eccentric means that we are lengthening tissue. In this case, we are lengthening tissue under load. To do an external rotation eccentric stretch from 90-90, I'm going to actively drive this whole front leg into the ground. As I push that leg into the ground, I'm going to slowly, effectively resist the lowering of my torso into the ground. As I get to the basement of the stretch, I'm going to put my hands to the side of the leg, help myself back up to a tall position. The same progression reviewed a moment ago, arms crossed, arms to the side, arms vertical, applies here as well. So with my arms crossed, I'm driving my leg into the ground, slowly lowering, maybe a 5-second count or longer, push, and come back up. I'll complete again 4, 5, 6 repetitions of that eccentric stretch, really hitting the back of that hip hard. Next stop now will be our 90-90 external rotation PAILs and rails. The PAILs and rails sequence involves first a 60 to 120 second stretch. The more time you spend in the stretch, the more time under tension for the tissue being stretched, thereby the greater adaptation effect on the tissue. I'm going to keep my chest up, my shoulders up, kind of nice and proud, and I'm going to hinge forward over that front leg. I'm feeling a deep, strong stretch in the back of my front hip. I'm going to hold this position now for 60 to 90 seconds, 120 if I'm feeling ambitious. For the purposes of this video, we will pretend that I've been here now for a full 90 seconds. My PAIL sequence is going to involve a gradual, ramping isometric effort of driving this leg using the progressive tissue on the back of the hip into the ground. So I start to push the leg into the ground like I'm trying to push the earth away from my body. I'm beginning with a 10% effort. I'm ramping to a 30% effort, to a 50% effort. I'm going to brace, tension the rest of my body, radiating force everywhere, ramping to 70%. And now my strongest but safest effort, I'm driving my leg into the ground, I'm holding, I'm pushing the earth away as hard as I can comfortably for another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, release. I'm slowly releasing the tension. Notice I'm still at depth in the stretch here. Next sequence will be my rails effort. My rails will use the regressive tissue in the front of the hip here and groin. The cue is to imagine that we have a ball or a water balloon trapped between the hip and the belly. We're going to try to crush that ball. It can even help to kind of put a fist into that space and try to squeeze your thigh, squeeze your belly into that fist, and you will feel that work way up high in the front of the hip. Another idea here is that our intention is as though we're going to try and lift this leg straight up off the ground. When we are actually at depth in the stretch, the act of lifting the leg off the ground is not going to happen, okay? But that is the idea, that is the intention of our tension, okay? So, I finished those PAILs, I've released the PAILs effort, and beginning rails effort, hard, firm contraction, trying to squeeze that water balloon, and I'm lifting the leg, I'm trying to hover it off the ground, holding, it's uncomfortable, we're going to embrace that, we're holding, we're holding, we're holding, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, release. Now, we have an option to continue into a second sequence of PAILs and rails there. Following the completion of your rails effort, you can stay at depth in the stretch for another maybe 30 seconds or so, ultimately whatever time you need just to breathe, just to rest, okay? Follow that, increasing effort PAILs, that ramping isometric again, hold your strongest, safest effort PAILs for about 10 to 15 seconds, release the PAILs effort, immediately into a high effort rails contraction, hold that for 10 to 15 seconds, then come out of the stretch. We're now going to regress this position slightly to come down onto an elbow, so we're not so worried about the vertical position of the torso anymore. We're now going to complete what's called a passive range hold. With a passive range hold, for external rotation, I'm going to grab my ankle like so. From this position, a passive range hold will involve me moving my hand away and resisting the loss of external rotation, which is to say, I've pulled myself passively into this position. I'm going to start squeezing with my regressive tissue in the front of the hip and groin. I'm squeezing, 1, 2, 3, releasing and hold. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, help. Deepening that position passively, squeezing again, regressive tissue. 1, 2, 3, hold, hold, hold. 4, 3, 2, 1, and release. I'll complete 4 to 5, 5+ second effort passive range holds. That sequence, beginning with the kinetic stretching, following with the eccentric stretching, followed with the 90-90 pails and rails, and finally with the 90-90 regressed passive range hold. It's going to target all of the tissue around that hip, both the stuff in the front, the stuff that's getting stretched in the back, and expose the hip to ultimately probably maybe even 10 minutes or so of sustained external rotation, time under tension on the hip. Done 2-3 times in a week, that sequence, over a number of weeks, and the capacity for external rotation, the movement potential into external rotation will increase. One of the best ways to use that external rotation is with hip cars. So find one of the other videos I have on my channel demonstrating hip cars, either from a standing position, a quadruped position. Any of those things work great. We're going to move the hip joint around in space with cars after using some kind of loaded stretch sequence like we've done to open up space. And then we use the space with the cars.